This is the Cloud Ace podcast, bringing you the latest in cloud security through captivating chats with fascinating cybersecurity experts who are leaving their mark on the industry. Cloud Ace is brought to you by the SANS Institute and hosted by SANS fellow Frank Kim. And now, prepare for departure. We're cleared for takeoff. Here's your captain, Frank Kim.
Hello and welcome to the SANS Cloud Ace podcast. I'm extremely excited to have with us here today Rinki Sethi, who is currently the CISO at Bill and was previously the CISO at Twitter. And we'll get into all of Rinki's background here as well, all of the other amazing companies that you've been at. But Rinki, thanks a lot for joining.
Frank, thanks for having me.
All right, great. Well, hey, with that, let's go ahead and dive right in. I like to start these episodes here with a little bit of personal background. And you had previously shared with me just a little bit about the influence that your dad had on you. Can you share a little bit about your personal and family history and how did that perhaps influence your choice of career?
Yes. So I was born and raised in the Bay Area by immigrant parents. Education was a really, really strong focus in our household. And I was lucky in some ways that my dad was an early adopter of technology from like the time I could remember. I grew up when I was a little baby, and there's pictures of me in his lap using a computer and exposed. I think I was doing something on the keyboard, and so exposed to computers at a very early age, and that continued. And my interest with computers continued, he continued to foster that too. He was one of the early teachers of Java and other programming languages that had come out. But when I was starting to get into the high school age, there was an app called AOL Instant Messenger. And we all used to chat with our friends on that. And it was kind of this new hot thing. Well, my dad caught on pretty quick and thought we were wasting a lot of time and was wondering, I guess, what we were doing on there. And so one day I overhear him talking to my mom about something that I had privately chatted with one of my friends about. And so I was like, he has something on my machine. And I found that he had parental spyware or keylogger on my machine. I uninstalled it. I told my sister, hey, watch out. He's got he's got some kind of spyware. And then he would go back and install it again. And so I was like, I don't have time for this. I wrote a program to make sure I caught anytime he installed that spyware and would remove it from my laptop. And I gave that to my sister as well. And I think that's kind of where my hacker mindset, I realized I have a little bit of, I'm figuring out how to work around systems. And I went and did a computer science engineering degree, not knowing what I would do next, probably assuming I would be a developer, but somehow landed my first job out of college accidentally into cybersecurity.
That is very cool. So a lot of interesting touch points that you mentioned. I'm also originally from the San Francisco Bay Area, and you don't necessarily see a lot of Bay Area natives of our generation. So that's very cool. I also have an immigrant family as well, and I don't know about you, but growing up, all my parents was kind of stereotypical. They always talked about, hey, you got to be a doctor or a lawyer, and kind of a tech job or a cybersecurity, didn't even exist back in the day. Were they specifically saying similar things for you as well?
Oh, yeah. Mine was even more narrow. It was become a doctor or an engineer. When I said I wanted to be a lawyer, it was like, well, that's your second degree. What's your first degree going to be in? And so it was very specific on it's got to be some kind of engineering or you're going to go into medical school. And I knew that path, medical school, was not for me. So it was engineering, but absolutely the same mindset.
That is too funny. Hey, well, at least, you got the lesson in aiming high from an early age. Yeah, so that's very cool that you played a little bit of kind of hacker cat and mouse game with your dad back in the day. Kind of effectively creating your own anti-malware even at an early age. That is so cool.
Yeah, it was I definitely got some exposure. So you could say my dad influenced me in certain ways, and certain ways made me figure out how to bypass some of the tools that we had on there.
Yeah, my first job out of school was also as a developer, and I had actually no idea what I necessarily wanted to get into. But, given your kind of the roots of how you got into security, can you walk us through a little bit about kind of how you started your career, where you started your career, and kind of the path that you've taken up until now?
Yeah, and I'll try to make it brief. So I graduated from college at a really bad time. It was after the dot-com bust had happened. There weren't that many jobs. Most of my friends in college were going and getting their master's degree or figuring out what they were going to do next. I happened to go to a recruiting night with one of my friends, and it was with PG&E, and they were recruiting on our campus at UC Davis, and I wasn't being recruited, but I was like, free pizza, I'll go. And they had and I just started talking to one of the hiring managers that happened to be there, and he asked me, what's your favorite class you're taking? And I said, cryptography. And he said, wow, who are you taking the class with? And I mentioned the professor's name, and he said, oh, I know that professor, and he wrote one of the first textbooks for colleges in that subject. And so he's like, I'd love to interview you for this job we have in information protection. And I was like, I'll take any interview at that point. I didn't know what it meant. I interviewed. I was probably one of like 50 kids that was interviewing for that position, ended up getting the job. And that was my entrance into what we now call cybersecurity. And I got my first job there. So I worked at PG&E for about, I think it was 2 or 3 years. I was an analyst. I did some engineering work. I realized I didn't know much about security. So I started studying and got my master's degree online in information security. I started that at PG&E. I started getting some certifications and just learning what information security was about. And I decided that I needed to, given that I had this computer science engineering degree, I needed to go back to my engineering roots. So I started looking for a role where I would be much more technical engineer. And I happened to get a role at Walmart.com. Did security engineering there. I found my passion in cybersecurity while I was there and had a really good mentor that helped kind of show me the ropes and everything to do with information security, everything from how do you do a vulnerability scan, how do you do a pen test, what is application security, why is security training important? I learned everything there. I had my first child when I was there, and then decided I needed to find a job that was closer to home. And so that took me to eBay. I went to eBay to drive security culture change, and rules changed. They had me do several things, but that's where my career really took off. I was a chief of staff for the security organization. I ran several teams in security, and then I had my second child and was looking for a change. I went to Intuit to be a security business partner. 3 months after I joined, they said, Rinki, we want you to take over the product security team. We want to transform how we do security as we move not just to the cloud, but to public cloud, moving data from TurboTax and other products that they sold into public cloud, into AWS. So I helped with that transformation. And then was there for a few years before moving to Palo Alto Networks. I ran security operations at Palo Alto Networks, built it from scratch, scaled it, made it something that customers could come and see. And then made a little bit of a career mistake. I went to IBM. I was there for 6 months before I took on my first job as Chief Information Security Officer at Rubrik, which is a startup company that's just booming right now, and was there, helped them start their entire security program globally. And then COVID hit and things had to scale back a little bit, and I was looking for another challenge. So I took on the role of CISO at Twitter during a very interesting time right after they had the security breach, right before the U.S. election. And then I left right before the acquisition had happened and joined Bill. And I've been at Bill for the last year and a half, leading both IT and security. And in the last 5-6 years, I would say I've also joined a couple boards. I sit on the board of ForgeRock. I got to be there in their journey to go public, and now they're on their journey to go private again. And then I also sit on the board of VaultTree and advise a dozen security startups or so. So that's been a highlight too. It's fun to do the security work. I'm very passionate about it, but some of the board work and all of that has definitely enhanced, just my experience.
Wow, that's an incredible career journey. Thanks a lot for sharing that. You worked at, had a number of great experiences, worked at a number of amazing organizations there, and kind of going all the way from analyst back in the day to a multi-time CISO now. So that is a very cool journey. And, we first met, when you were at Intuit back some years ago. And, I remember, it was around that time that cloud was first, kind of coming to the forefront here. And certainly now today, everyone organization pretty much is in cloud to some degree. And cloud is a lot more well understood here. And so kind of based on what you've seen from your previous roles and even where you are today, how did you build that cloud security expertise, not only for yourself, but for your team members as well?
Yeah. First of all, I didn't realize it's been a decade, Frank, since I've known you. It went by fast. it was really interesting. When I took over this team around product security, there was almost a resistance to change, right? Like folks were wanting to do security the same way that they understood it at the time. And so everybody's starting to learn about AWS, and AWS was not back then what it is today. And their capabilities around security were so different. And for them to take on a company like Intuit at that time was so early for them, right? So now it feels like things have just completely transformed in 10 years, but there was a real mindset shift needed in the folks that were in the security org on, you need to rethink things like the cloud, how you architect apps, how you think about security, how you can bake in security earlier on, and why that's even more important than ever, all required a mindset and culture change, and people that wanted to learn and innovate and do things differently. And so that was a really interesting journey to go through. It was very challenging because how do you change culture in a team, and you can't execute on what you need to do until you can build that in first. Now, a decade from now, it's still like many companies, being at Rubrik and listening to our customers or Palo Alto Networks, and now even at Bill, we're early in our cloud journey, but there's still companies that are still early in their journey into cloud. But now that's in such a more mature state, and there's so many solutions out there on how and advice on how to do it right. And then many companies, I think where Intuit was about 10 years ago, many companies are going through that journey right now. And it's really interesting to see.
Yeah. Hey, you mentioned Palo Alto, which is, of course, a well-known leader in security. You mentioned Rubrik, with a focus on zero trust and those kind of emerging capabilities, if you will. Kind of if you take a step back from a big picture perspective, how do you tend to think about your overall cloud security capabilities, your security architecture, especially as it relates to cloud?
Yeah, I think like you mentioned it, I think that zero trust, and it's become this buzzword now, but like, how do you make sure that you verify, and make sure that you're building that you're on that journey of zero trust. And especially because everything's no longer within your own perimeters, which is exactly how it was when I started my career, right? If you wanted to get into your data center, you had VPN, but again, that was in your own network. Now things have just completely changed. Having worked at different types of companies, especially I think when the pandemic hit, you could see which companies it was like no change. You just go home and work instead of working in the office. And it's because these companies that were born cloud first, that had all SaaS applications, didn't have their own data centers. And it was like they had built already for a remote world. Whereas other companies really struggled. They were like, oh my gosh, now our employees are going to go home. We have no visibility into anything. And so you're starting to think about that zero trust journey a little bit later. And it was a little bit more of a struggle. But I think now, as companies build in this hybrid world that we live in, you're thinking about that from the very inception of the company, right? Where it's how do you build in a way where it's zero trust? How do you build that right from the beginning?
Yeah, exactly. In terms of kind of these principles and these modern engineering practices, you mentioned earlier kind of the mindset and being able to shift the culture overall. I've had numerous friends and colleagues in security in years past say, hey, Frank, I hate DevOps. It's just a excuse for developers to have root access in production, which, couldn't be further from the truth, right? That's an indication of a lack of understanding of how things actually work. And, in terms of, you mentioned another keyword earlier in terms of mentorship. How do you start to guide people in the right direction? How do you shift that culture overall? What are some kind of practical things that have worked for you over the years?
I think data always helps, right? When you go in and you try to change a culture and you're trying to say you have to do this because it's important, and folks will say, oh yeah, but it's like that's not going to happen to us. Like a breach is not going to happen to us. This isn't going to happen to us. I think you have to show them, right? I found a lot of success in a couple ways. One, of course, like sharing with them, like if you're trying to convince a marketing team that they need to do something more securely, showing how other marketing teams have been impacted, either whether it's by social engineering or phishing or some tool that they're using that they didn't consider the security ramifications for. All of that, I think, is important data to bring as you're trying to change the culture. For engineers, I've seen that find a security hole in their code and show what you can do through a red team exercise. And all of a sudden you start seeing folks really realize how what they're doing can have massive impact if they're not taking security seriously and they're not taking that on as a responsibility. The other thing I've found that's been really fun actually, and has worked really well in the past few companies is I like to make my executive team champions. So I all the way from the CEO down, right? And I take them and we make these funny videos where we make someone doing the wrong thing as it relates to security. And there's a few folks from the executive team that'll come in and save the day. And we show that at our company, All Hands. And so quarterly, we'll make a video like that where a CEO or CFO or CMO are in the videos. It's become a part of the culture. People are waiting for the video every quarter. What is the security message going to be this quarter? And it gets like thousands of just messages and people just love it. And it starts being something that people talk about, right? And we're talking about security. So I think there's a lot of things you can do around the culture. I think regular training, I think there's two schools of thought around incidents, right? Do hide incidents like we used to in the security team, like it's totally like you don't share with anybody, you keep it private, you keep it confidential, you're in a private room. But now we're starting to learn like, yes, there might be certain incidents you just can't share broadly, but there's a lot you can. And there's so many things to learn from that, right? Whether you take it to the board or the executive team or to the team that the incident impacted, I think being transparent and saying like, how do we make sure this doesn't happen again is super important.
That is very cool how you have the executives participate in those videos. When you were first describing it, I thought you were going to say that it was the executives that did, you tape them doing something wrong or making a mistake. But it makes sense to have them come in and be the example of kind of saving the day and fixing the problem. There's that element of that executive peer pressure, right? Of, oh, well, if senior leadership is doing it, then we've got to do it too. That's a really great example.
Yeah, I was just in the elevator and like, someone didn't badge in. Someone said, hey, you need to go and make sure you badge in. And it's all part of like that campaign. Maybe that's because I was in the elevator, but there is that culture of people, holding others accountable.
Yeah, great. Now, you mentioned kind of your long history across various companies and various industries. You've been in the energy sector, the retail sector, some of the largest technology companies, financial services, security companies, and so on. And, related to, I guess, that culture and that mindset, but also just curious, are there any notable commonalities or differences that you've seen between the security programs at these different places based upon the business and the industry?
Yeah, there's a lot of like the principles that we run by as security practitioners, they don't change, right? From company to company, they're pretty much the same. I think what's changed is a couple things. Now, having done this for 20 years, the world is different, like so different. How we thought about security, like there were no CISOs. I don't remember hearing the CISO title until about 5 years into my career. And I think eBay was one of the first non-banking companies that had a CISO back then. So things have changed drastically. I think time has been a big thing in seeing change. But like, for example, how private companies run security is very different than how public companies do. There's usually private companies are focused on, let's get a product out the door, prove that we can generate revenue and that there's a customer demand. And so security, although they're starting to think about it and have to, it's not maybe the highest investment area and it may be something that's lagging. Whereas like you're in utility this day and age or fintech, it's highly regulated, right? There's so many regulations around financial transactions and so forth. And so that makes it very different, a lot more scrutiny around security, a lot more audits that you go through. And so that's been a little bit of a learning that maybe my governance risk compliance team was very small at one company, but now at a company where you're going through bank audits and things like that on a very regular basis, your team may be larger. So I think that there is definitely difference between industries. There's difference in culture. There's difference in kind of like the championship level and understanding of every company when you join and where their state of security is. So you kind of have to assess that and then come up with your game plan on how am I going to go attack this and how are we going to build the strategy here. But it is quite different. But I would say like the principles have been the same. Like whether I go from this company, I care about identity and access management. You have to get that right. You've got to be on that zero trust journey. So there's some basic things that always remain the same. I think to what maturity level do you take the company? To what degree of scrutiny is there on your controls? That changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love how you framed that in terms of, hey, there are things that don't change, that stay the same in terms of perhaps those first principles of security and really having that grounding in terms of what needs to be done on a day-to-day basis. experiences, but tying that back and adapting that to the culture and the organization and the industry, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We mentioned a couple times kind of mentorship here, and I get this question a lot from various folks at different stages of their career, both early on and even people that are further on in their careers, is kind of how do they take the next step in their career? And I think, you're a shining example of that in terms of kind of taking the next step at various points. How do you go about finding a mentor? What has worked for you from a mentorship perspective? Also, have you ever had a sponsor, right, that has kind of been able to connect you with some of these different opportunities?
Totally. And I think people think that mentors have to come in a certain size or form or something like that, meaning that they have to have a certain title for you to go and I think one of the biggest things for you to realize is that I didn't realize it actually in the moment. It was later that I realized that this person at Walmart was my mentor. They'd taken me under their wings and said, like, Rinki, I'm just going to teach you. I don't know why. I still to this day don't know why. Maybe they were interested in that, getting more people into cybersecurity, make sure people don't leave. I don't know what it was, but he took me under his wings. And I realized later that was a mentor of mine and he was a peer of mine that just taught me things. I think understanding mentors can come, sometimes they can be bosses, sometimes they can be people on different teams. You might already have a mentor, but recognizing that is really important. And you don't necessarily need to formalize it, but I think a lot of times they can be your peers. Sometimes they can even be someone that reports to you. Like it could be anybody. And I think what you need at any point changes. And there may not be one mentor that can help you in every area as you grow your career. You may need a different kind of mentor, or you may need a very specific mentorship for some specific thing you're trying to accomplish. And so that changes. Early on for me, it was like, how do I navigate politics and how do I navigate leadership or how do I influence the culture of a company? Later, it changed into I got myself into a sticky situation and now I don't know which board position to choose. And so I'm looking for somebody who might have been in a similar situation to guide me. And so I think it changes from place to place. And for me, I've been fortunate that I've found mentors in the companies I've been working at and, have latched onto that. And I'm not super good at keeping in touch with people, but I think it's important. Like I'll reach out to the person and I'm like, I need help on this thing, and be surprised at how giving people are with their time. And then I have had sponsors too, right? Like I had someone who is a peer of mine at Palo Alto Networks who introduced me to the board position at ForgeRock as an example, or a person who I worked at a prior company with who always reaches out and says, Rinki, I thought of you for this opportunity, and considered some of these folks as like massive sponsors, of me and of my career.
Yeah, that's great. The key thing I took away from what you were saying is just being open to the opportunity, being open to accepting the help there, and kind of putting yourself out there a little bit in that way. You mentioned the couple of board roles, and I think when I talk to different folks in the security industry, different security leaders, different people at different points of their career, one of the common things that often comes up is they want to try to figure out how to potentially get some board roles in the future, whether it be a publicly traded company or a privately traded one. You gave a little bit of a hint as to how that opportunity with ForgeRock came about, but can you go into a little bit more detail about, your journey in terms of looking for those roles and what that entails?
Yeah, I think what I've realized is, and this is very my personal experience and maybe different than what others have faced. I tried everything, Frank. Like I tried to go and I started by advising startups. I started networking with the VCs, all in the hopes of I want a board position, right? So started advising startups thinking that would lead to it. I started advising VCs hoping that would take any VC call to take feedback on products, right? That didn't work. And so then I went through this board coaching type program for women. That totally didn't work. And they're supposed to match you to a board position. And for me, I felt like that board coaching program was changing my voice, changing who I authentically was. And it didn't work for me. And it actually frustrated me and almost made me feel like if this is what it is to do a board position, that I'm not sure that it's for me. And so that didn't work for me. And what I realized is like, in order to you need especially I think women need board positions to get experience being board members. And I think people in general, even CISOs, need board positions to get that experience. And what I realized is as my network grew, as I worked at these different companies, my network is what's gotten me both the board positions I'm on. It was somebody I worked with at Palo Alto Networks who is at ForgeRock now. She was like, we're expanding our board now that we're planning on going public a few years ago. Rinki, can you meet our CEO? And let's see if this works out. And it did, right? And with VaultTree, it was the same thing. It came through my network. It was a CISO that I had networked with who's on a bunch of boards and invests himself that said, this is a great one for you to come and join if you're open to it. And so that's kind of how those board positions happen. It's kind of been through my network. And I think there were a lot of things that prepared me for it too. I think advising companies, startups, really helped me understand financials and a lot of things that I don't have on the day-to-day CISO. And then I learned a lot in the boardroom and from my peers in the boardroom as well, to make me a better public company board member.
Mm-hmm. Great. Really points to the importance of building those relationships and cultivating those over time. That is great. Earlier you also mentioned, having to make a decision between a couple different board roles or maybe different seats on the same board. Can you go into a little bit of detail? What were those opportunities and, why did you just pick one over the other?
So at the time when I was selecting board positions, there was a company that I got involved with that was with an activist investor. I was so I wanted to be on a board at that point. And as that progressed and the interviews and all that, there's a lot of process that goes into an activist board nomination, board member nomination. And I kind of started understanding it and realizing this is not for me through the middle of the process where it was kind of a little late. And I had to get advice on what do I do now? Because I'm going to break relationships and probably end up in a bad place. And this is where I needed mentorship. And maybe that product is a little bit competitive to another company that I was interviewing for. It all worked out in the end. I backed out of the other one. I ended up taking the ones I did. But that, you don't know how to navigate that until you get into the situation. Then you need to talk to somebody that's been through it. And fortunately, I got some really good advice where it was okay, let's just break down this problem and talk through it in logical steps. And it landed in a place and I knew exactly what I needed to go and do and which company I wanted to be on the board for.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really important as you're selecting a board. I'm really lucky I got the ForgeRock experience. I think is going to be a hard one to beat. The board members are just amazing. It's it's just a great team and it's a great CEO. And so I think that's going to be a hard one to beat. I think knowing that this is a company you believe in, a CEO you believe in, a board group that you want to work with, and they're going to be supportive, especially if it's a first board position.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, ForgeRock may be a little bit unique in the sense that it is a technology vendor. It's in the security space, focused on identity and access management. Now, I know that most boards, they don't tend to focus on security specifically. They might not always have a technology background. What have you found is the level of knowledge at the board level about cybersecurity? And then really, how do you frame those security items around more so business risks to make things understandable to the board?
Yeah. Are you talking about, Frank, me being a CISO presenting to a board or me as a CISO being on a board?
Yeah, great clarification. I think both. Maybe if we could take it first as the CISO, which I think a lot of our listeners will resonate with.
Yeah, I think with me as a CISO presenting to the boards that I've presented to, I realized a couple things. One, board members have varying knowledge of cybersecurity. So you kind of have to baseline that, which means you have to have a one-on-one relationship with the board members. Most CISOs present to an audit committee or maybe a risk committee of some sort. Now, more and more, there's cybersecurity committees that are forming where I think they are bringing in cybersecurity expertise into the committee as well. But I think baselining that, I think getting an understanding of what is it that you want to share with the board? What is it that the board members want as well? And making it an active dialogue where it's not just a presentation. I think those things have proven really well for me. I think making sure that they understand here are the risks that you're tracking. Here's how you're mitigating those risks. Here are the programs you have in place. And then how ready are you if you were to have a breach? And how are you going to handle that? And what's the readiness level? And how do you practice that? And that's really important as well. And then finally, I think it's you have to have that conversation with Rinki, what keeps you up at night? And hopefully the board members are having that dialogue. It's not just about the metrics and the data presented in the deck, but you're having this very active dialogue. And I think that's really important. Me as a CISO in the boardroom, It's hard for me. Both the boards. I'm part of our like security or security adjacent companies, and so they're like they're very security minded. Everybody understands the security space pretty well. But what I do is I have an active relationship with the CISOs at those companies, and I very regularly talk to them, understand kind of what they're worried about inside the boardroom, outside the boardroom as well. And a lot of times I'm that voice that will ask a lot of questions when the topic is cybersecurity in the boardroom. And folks will ask like, hey, Rinki, like, how do you see this? Give us a better understanding. And a lot of times I'll do that in the boardroom. A lot of times it's the CISO that's doing that of the company.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, that's some great insight from both sides of the table as the CISO presenting to the board and being on the board itself. Now, switching topics here a little bit, back to some of the security specific capabilities. Kind of as you're thinking about continuing to grow and mature your program, what are you most excited about in cloud security and cybersecurity overall, whether it be capabilities, tools, techniques, or things that your team is planning for?
Yeah, what I'm excited about is like I've been at like when you think about security and you take over kind of a program, it could be one of many things, right? One, you're building from scratch, which is super fun. Sometimes you're taking something and you've just got to completely transform it. Sometimes it's scaling. And we're at a point where like we've got an amazing team. How do we scale the program? How do we make sure that we're ready for the growth of the company of Bill? Like Bill is a beast and I want to see it be a rocket ship. And how do we make sure that security is scaling with that growth? How do we learn from the things that we've done either well or not well and continue to improve that? And I think that's what I'm most excited about. I continue to be so impressed by the security startups that are popping up. And I think we have a team that's very excited about innovation. So how can we, are there some little players out there that are going to really compete against some of the big ones that are out there in certain areas where we still need innovation, right? We talk a lot about zero trust. There's still so much, I think, room for innovation in that space. And so how do we go and create room to go and innovate and test out some of these products? Those are the things I'm most excited about. The other, I'm more and more impressed with I think we're still slow, but I've seen in my career the improvement in diversity in cybersecurity. My team is, I'm really proud to say that we've got really good representation in our team. I hope to continue that. I hope to continue to see where it was 5%. We've seen 10%, now close to 20% women. And so I'm hoping that we continue to see not just more women in the space, but just more diversity as whole. And I'm really excited about that. We need that in this space.
I want to circle back to what you mentioned about the startups in a moment, but for now, I want to zoom in a little bit more on the diversity aspect. You've mentioned kind of being able to grow the representation on the team from a women and minority perspective. What has worked to do that? Because that's hard unless you put focused kind of thought and effort behind it. It doesn't just happen by itself. What have you found that's made a difference?
I think you start with your leadership team. Like you start with making sure that's a diverse group. And when you start thinking right from the beginning of building in, or even if you're transforming, that if you want, when you think about diversity, you bring in diverse folks, they bring in more diverse folks, and it just becomes a team, and it's natural at that point. And I think that's been a huge focus. I think how we recruit, making sure that your recruiting process is going to recruit diverse talent, that you're not just going to get the same kind of folks because your job descriptions aren't right, or you're looking at the same schools, or you're not opening up to looking at different kinds of degrees. And so I think it's really important to look at all of it. But I think it's a mindset that starts with the leadership team, because if you set that from the get-go, then I think you start building that down below. And I think that's really important.
Mm-hmm. Great. Now, circling back, in terms of the startups, for me, most of my career, let's say 80% has been at large companies, large enterprises, 20% has been at smaller companies. And I've typically found that in large companies, it's, we've got the big established vendors or products that we might use. There's that old saying that nobody gets fired for buying IBM, and it's kind of perhaps becoming nowadays, maybe nobody gets fired for buying Microsoft nowadays. And so I mentioned that here because it was always hard in the past for me at these large enterprises to buy the cutting edge, the latest and greatest startups, the very small companies, because we factor in, what's the viability of the company, how big are they, and so on. So I always tried to allocate 10, 15, it's depending on the place, upwards of 20% of my portfolio to certain smaller bets that, hey, maybe in 3 years, we're going to move on to something else. Maybe in a couple of years, we'll move on to something else. How are you? But one of the challenges that I had is that, my team, they're overwhelmed in the day to day. And they, while they're interested in new technologies, they didn't necessarily want to take time to start to play with, practice, and operationalize something else. How did you get their buy-in, and how do you think about that from a portfolio management perspective?
Yeah, there's a couple things. I guess you don't want to become that CISO that's just like tossing every technology because we're excited about it. And I do that sometimes, and the team then pushes back saying, Rinki, this is too much. So I think it's important, we need to tie whatever cool products that are out there, the new tech that's out there, back to the business problems that we're trying to solve and back to the security risks that we're trying to mitigate. And I think when you do that, you'll find some of the products that are existing large products, we have challenges with them. And so I think it's saying okay, are there things that we have that, yes, it would be a pain maybe to take it out, but maybe someone's doing it so well right now in a startup space that it could save us a ton of time, money. It might save us, it might be a better experience altogether for our employees. And so I think having that mindset as you start evaluating, I think is important. I also think incentivizing innovation within the team and incentivizing, when you do find a startup that's doing something way better, or a startup that's solving something that you didn't solve, and the team kind of spends time to do that, you have to incentivize that in the right way that people do want to do that. And then, yes, they should have the way to speak up to say, we're not able to focus on what we need to do because there's too much of this noise. And then you got to give them the time to do that. But I think as you scale the team, you get more bandwidth to do some of this stuff. And I think you have to make sure that you're hiring people that care to innovate and care to go and look into some of these new technologies.
Yeah, great. It's really, you mentioned it's basically the what's in it for me, what's in it for the business, but also what's in it for your team member, what's in it for the engineer, what's in it for the administrator in terms of making that switch or adopting something new. So yeah, that's goes back to the mindset and the culture and, like you said, the incentives associated with it. So yeah, that's really nicely put. Rinki, I want to go ahead and switch things up a little bit here, give you an opportunity, if you have any, to ask me a question, a little bit of a reverso around here.
I do, yeah, because you're a CISO. You're you did the investment gig for a while, like a VC gig. What's life after? What are we going to do after being a CISO? What do you see as that career path? Because I've been folks ask me, I don't have a clean answer, but they're okay, you've reached CISO. What do you do after that? And now we've seen some people take on CT, some really it's been inspirational to see some CISOs take on CTO roles. But what do CISOs do after?
Yeah, that is a really good question. And, this is the first time I'm hearing it. We didn't kind of prep for this question. So, I'm a little bit at a loss for words, partly because it's also a personal journey, right, that I'm continuously trying to go on and figure out along the way. And, for me, I feel a little bit lucky, as, I've been in this like yourself for over 20 years here, a couple decades. And many years ago, I started teaching with SANS. And, I didn't know where that would necessarily lead. But, fast forward to today, had the honor of being more involved in SANS and kind of working on some of the curriculum, the cloud curriculum and the leadership curriculum. And I remember some years ago, I had an interview for a CISO gig that, I didn't wind up taking it. It didn't work out for various reasons. But one of the questions that really stuck out to me was they said, hey, so Frank, if you're not doing this, what is it that you would want to be doing? And I didn't have the answer right at that moment. But after reflecting upon it, I would say, well, hey, I would just be teaching more and I would be trying to help others at various points of their career journey. And so really, that's a long way of me saying that, hey, I really love what I'm doing in the sense of kind of teaching and consulting. And then, like you mentioned, being involved in the venture world and helping startups and young entrepreneurs on their journey, right? And trying to help them on their path to building capabilities that will help the industry as a whole and, specific customers' problems. So broadly speaking, for me, that's kind of what it is, kind of teaching and advising and, doing a little bit of investing. And I'm still really, loving that. And so, yeah, I see other CISOs, like you said, they think about, well, there are some career CISOs in terms of they go from CISO gig to CISO gig kind of until retirement, but others that take on, like yourself, board opportunities and take on other roles. But for me right now, who knows what 2-3 years will bring. But yeah, I think that's where I'm at right now, Rinki.
Yeah, I love that. Thanks for answering that. I think it's going to be helpful to a lot of us that are listening out there.
Yeah. Now, hey, you've also got this journey that you've been on. And I guess, maybe if I can, I'll ask the same question back to you. I mean, after being a multi-time CISO, having such a long journey in security and, having different board roles, kind of what do you think about?
It's interesting because I feel like I could go so many paths still. I could stay CISO, so that that can I love my gig right now, and so that's obviously one thing. But if I think like 5 to 10 years out, I could also see myself owning my own security company. I could see myself consulting. I could see myself maybe just doing board and advisory roles. I just that's why I'm like, I'm not sure what I don't know, right? And I see these amazing CISOs that have taken on CTO roles. That sounds interesting. So I feel like there's so many possibilities, but right now I'm really enjoying kind of advising and doing the board and being CISO here at Bill. And so I'm really enjoying it. But yeah, I think there's, I think about it like 10 years from now, where will I be? And I think it could be any of those paths.
Great. Well, hey, Rinki, I think that is about as perfect of a place to end the show here as we can get. Rinki, thank you so much for joining and sharing your experiences and your insights and your overall journey. I think people will get a lot out of this episode. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Frank. This was fun.